Well, good afternoon, everybody, and opportunity to catch up, check in, and opportunity to introduce you to two interesting and extraordinary leaders that I think truly encapsulate the spirit of this moment and the spirit of where we want to take this moment in terms of the call and demands for change. I've had the privilege of traveling all up and down the state of California over the course of the last number of days. I had the opportunity to spend the day working with community leaders, faith leaders, working with advocates, working with members of our own National Guard to help clean up the streets of Sacramento. Randomly had the privilege and opportunity to meet up with a group of young people around the police officers' memorial that were cleaning up graffiti. A young girl, quite literally with one lung, that outlasted all of us as she was scrubbing away for hours and hours and hours. No one asked her to do it. It was just an act of random kindness and a recognition that her community was being impacted and her life and her future impacted by the moment. And she wanted to impact the community in a positive way. She, by the way, was also part of the protest the night before, but didn't like certain aspects of what she saw. I had the privilege of also working not only side by side with her, but with Stevante Clark, a well-known activist here in the Sacramento region, who also was working to clean up graffiti on the side of a state building. Both of us turned our heads to the right, and randomly we saw a member of our National Guard put down his weapon, unbeknownst to the two of us and others, and was scrubbing side by side with others graffiti off the side of a building. I had the chance to fly down to South LA, in the center of so much of the violence and protests and outrage in 1992. Went down with County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas. Went down with the chair of our budget committee, Senator Holly Mitchell. Met with members and leaders in the community, just randomly walked the streets, checked in on how people were feeling. None of the protests, none of the violence manifesting down in South LA. We talked about why that was the case. We learned about the history of institutional building, not just physical infrastructure, but human capital, human infrastructure. The resolve that people had to never again see what occurred in 1992 occur again in South LA. I had the chance to visit members of law enforcement, visit with community leaders, including one of my heroes. I'm here at the California Museum. It's also the home of the California Hall of Fame of some of the most inspired leaders that have left their mark on history that happen to have a strong identity here in the state of California. One of them that I had the privilege of recognizing just a few months ago was Reverend Lawson, known to many as one of the most influential leaders in the civil rights movement. He brought back forth the principles of nonviolence from Gandhi and brought them to the forefront of the consciousness of Dr. King. Met with him and leaders of Black Lives Matter, other leaders in the community, and had a conversation about the history of the civil rights movement. Going back, as we debated, to the 1950s, he argued back to 1947 and the impact Jackie Robinson had on the movement, not just Emmett Till, and that moment that marked a part of history that changed the momentum. Montgomery bus boycott, others that he organized and helped lead. What makes this moment different from that moment? Is this a moment or is this a movement? What part of our history are we living in and living through? Had the opportunity to meet with many youth leaders. And I'll tell you, of all the conversations I've had over the course of the last week in particular, it's the clarity and conviction of our youth. They don't mince words. They don't beat around the bush. They're not patient. They're not necessarily confident that folks in position like mine get it or have the capacity to get it done. They have no reservoir of patience. They demand progress. They demand people in position of power and influence to listen, but more important than anything else, they demand that people in power, position, and influence lead demonstrably, lead with courage, lead with conviction. But they also made a point, lead with civility. They pointed out, a number of these youth leaders, that violence has solved nothing. It's created nothing. There's nothing courageous about violent acts. I was reminded a little bit of what Kennedy spoke to, that no wrong has ever been righted by violence. To hear that from youth leaders leading protests in their community, peaceful protests, was humbling and also enlivening, because they want this moment to be met with a deeper sense of urgency, and they want their cause to be clear. It's a cause of peace, a cause of progress, and that violence has no place as it relates to meeting this moment and moving that collective cause forward. One thing I came back with, not only time out in the streets in Sacramento, in South LA, in Stockton, California, with a young leader, Mayor Tubbs, and many other youth leaders that he assembled, is that the black community does not need to change. We need to change. We have a responsibility to change. Our institutions need to change. Our capacity of understanding needs to change. We need to contextualize not only this moment, but moments in the past where we never met these calls and these cries, that we ran short. We ran long on rhetoric, short on results. Again, there's no reservoir for patience. That's self-evident just on your TV screen, but it's also self-evident in the minds and hearts and the values that you hear from people all across this state and all across the United States of America. This has been an extraordinary week in our nation's history, in the history of the state of California, and we have a unique and special responsibility here in California to meet it and to meet it head on. I'm also here at the California Museum for another reason, because I was here roughly a year ago, where California was demonstrably leading, incredible leadership that was assembled just downstairs from where I am here today, where we signed a landmark bill, the nation's toughest use of force laws on deadly force. AB 392 in the lexicon of the legislature, led by Dr. Shirley Weber, leaders like McCarty, many others, that led an effort to reconcile our antiquated practices as it relates to use of force. It was a controversial bill. There was previous efforts to advance the bill. They fell short. But assembled were not only elected officials, but leaders of all stripes, people that exercise every single day their moral authority, that helped create the conditions that led to the advancement of that landmark effort. Leaders who lost loved ones, leaders that were still cynical but willing to participate at this moment in hope and expectation that we can do more than just pass a program, but we can fundamentally solve a problem. And I am here today to say that program passing is indeed not problem solving unless we follow through on what we promote and promise, and we manifest a cultural change and a deeper understanding of what it is that we're trying to advance. We passed that bill last August, but it hasn't stopped violence, it hasn't stopped the mistrust, it hasn't stopped people from raising anxiety. We're seeing there's anxiety raised and concerns being brought to the forefront. We have so much work still left to do. There was a companion bill that was also part of that package, SB 230, that had deep frame of focus on implicit bias training, de-escalation techniques. So many of the provisions of that bill interestingly, go into effect in January 2021. That cannot happen soon enough. We're scrubbing components of that bill to see if we can fast track and concentrate some of those provisions to advance the cause that brought us together on that bill and move forward with a greater sense of urgency. I say that to reflect on a point of optimism and also frustration that California has been leading, but still we haven't done enough. I say this all the time. Success is not a place or a definition. It's a direction. There is no having made it as it relates to addressing these foundational and fundamental issues. We have extraordinary amount of work left to do. I'm proud of this state and proud of the cause of reform that goes beyond just the issue of implicit bias and de-escalation. It goes beyond just the issues of deadly use of force. We're very proud of this state and the leadership that we advance to begin anew a conversation about broader criminal justice reform to address the issues of the war on drugs and the disparities, the race-based sentencing, the 5-year minimum mandatory sentences that not too long ago were part and parcel of the culture of enforcement, and ultimately, as it relates to sentencing, 5-year mandatory sentence for having possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine. For those with possession of powder cocaine, it took 5,000 grams of cocaine to have the same 5-year minimum mandatory sentence. 5,000 to 1 ratio of disparity. I remember the Clinton administration knocked that down to 500 to 1. The Obama administration knocked it down further, but disparities still persist, not just as it relates to the consequences of drug possession, but across the criminal justice system. That's why the state was one of the early adopters of a new approach as it relates to cannabis reform and legalization around adult use of marijuana. It was a civil rights call from our perspective. I was proud to be out in front in those efforts. It was about addressing the disparities. It was about addressing incarceration. And it was about addressing the ills of this war on drugs. But again, it's not enough. We are proud of the work we've done in the state of California. We announced, and the legislature has embraced, the need to shut down state prisons in our current budget that I will sign in just a few weeks. It calls for shutting down 2 state prisons. It calls for eliminating the Department of Juvenile Justice. It calls for more probation reforms. All of this building on the work that we've done on Prop 57, Prop 47, Prop 36, the work we continue to do in this state to end the death penalty in the state of California. I was proud to sign an executive order on a moratorium on the death penalty because one thing we know about our criminal justice system, it's not blind. It discriminates based on the color of your skin, discriminates based on wealth. It has been said over and over again. It cannot be said enough. We have a criminal justice system. I don't think this. I know this. As governor, I live this every day. A criminal justice system that treats people that are rich and guilty a hell of a lot better than it treats people that are poor and innocent. You know that, and I know that. So why aren't we doing something about it? We're trying our best here in the state, but we have to do more, still better. And I understand this conversation that we need to be having in the state of California just cannot be about criminal justice. It has to be about economic justice, social justice, environmental justice. It has to be so much richer and deeper than it's been in the past. That's why we created that Surgeon General position in the state of California, to begin to focus on the issues that manifest early in life, prenatal care, the focus on ACEs and early childhood trauma, focusing on prenatal care as well as preschool, early Head Start, not just Head Start, focusing on achievement gap before it manifests, because at the end of the day, we can consume ourselves with achievement gap, but we know that people aren't left behind in society, they start behind in society. So if we're gonna get serious about addressing these disparities, then we've gotta get serious about our work in that space as well. And we have committed ourselves to that cause. Education reform. My gosh, 10% of black students, 10% of black students met the state benchmarks on math proficiency last year, 10% by 8th grade. All of the disruption around COVID-19 and learning loss, study just came out today It should be seared in your minds and consciousness. A study that came out today that says the average learning loss in this nation because of COVID-19 is 7 months. But for the Black community, 10.3 months. For low-income community, over 1 year of learning loss because of the impacts of COVID-19. You think we got an achievement gap right now? What are we going to do about that? And by the way, I just want to be clear and respectful at the same time to California legislature. One thing we're not going to do is take the $4.4 billion that we promoted in our budget and dilute it by taking it away from concentration funding for Black and brown communities and those that are former foster youth and low income and English as second learners. I will reject any proposal that comes out of the legislature that does that. We are committed to the cause of equity. And that's the reason we put that $4.4 billion in the budget, to focus on equity. And Governor Brown said it better than any of us. There is no equal application in unequal systems. You can't just spread that money out equally. We need to concentrate its focus. And I just want to make that clear as responsibly and respectfully I can to the legislature. I won't budge on that budget proposal. We have to do more and better, not just in education, not just addressing issues as it relates to birth and 0 to 5, but we also have to start thinking more systemically, more broadly about income supports. We're proud in this state to have doubled our earned income tax credit, proud in this state to begin the process of doing more on child care and empowering caregivers by organizing caregivers and giving them the power and capacity, their voice to lead, to focus on pay equity. All of these issues. I can go on, except to say that we're seeding a lot of these things in the state of California, but it's not enough. We have work to do, and we have a responsibility to do more than we have in the past. And so I want to make clear that those efforts must continue, and we must double down, and we must recognize those gaps that continue to persist in the state and this nation. And so today I want to make a few announcements in terms of advancing that cause of recognition, understanding, and resolve. One thing that is crystal clear to me, having seen images that inspired me of peaceful protests, that protesters have the right not to be harassed. Protesters have the right to protest peacefully. Protesters have the right to do so without being arrested, gassed, be shot at by projectiles. That's a simple value statement. I want to make that crystal clear. They have the right not to be harassed, not to be denied, not to be arrested for peaceful protesting. Period, full stop. But it's clear on the images we see on TV, on the reality of a grandmother in La Mesa, California, that's in the hospital, that some people are denied that fundamental right. And then we're not seeing people treated equally all across the state of California. Now, we have rules and regulations, the California Highway Patrol, as it relates to how we use projectiles and how we use tear gas and how we use force to protect the peace. Not deadly force in this case, but broadly. National Guard has a frame. But municipalities have different approaches. And it's clear to me that we need to standardize those approaches. And so I have had the privilege, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from two extraordinary leaders that I've known for years and have been admiring in terms of their leadership. One is Latifah Simon, social justice warrior, who's been on the front lines of this cause for years and years, and Ron Davis, who was a former captain in the Oakland Police Department for many, many years and chaired Barack Obama, was the executive director of Barack Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force that put out a report on reforming these tactics. And he, to his credit, is going to advise our efforts with Latifah, working with journalists, working with advocates, working with law enforcement, together collectively to standardize our approach of engagement and to begin to address what we are seeing with our own eyes and people are experiencing all across this state and this nation as it relates to the disparities of approaches that exist around peaceful protesting and how we control crowds in a responsible way that protects people's fundamental constitutional rights and protects people's safety at the same time. And so you'll hear from them, and I'm very pleased at their commitment to this cause and their resolve to advise us and to move forward very deliberative speed with recommendations to standardize these approaches in the very, very near term. Accordingly, it goes without saying, we cannot see the kind of techniques that tragically and ironically we train. I own this. We own this. Across this country, we train techniques on strangleholds that put people's lives at risk. Now, we can argue that these are used as exceptions, but at the end of the day, a carotid hold that literally is designed to stop people's blood from flowing into their brain, that has no place any longer in 21st century practices and policing. And so I am immediately directing POST, which is our police officers training, to end the training of that practice. And I could not be more pleased. No sooner did we make a commitment on this proposal that a member of the legislature, Mike Gibson, to his credit, just introduced a piece of legislation that I will support and sign as soon as it gets to my desk to legislatively end that practice in the state of California. We did that years and years ago as it relates to chokeholds, decades ago, understandably, but not some of these techniques on strangleholds. And we have got to update our practices in that place as well. So that we will do immediately with a deep sense of urgency, as well as we organize a new construct on how we focus on crowd control and help support peaceful protesting in the state and continue our leadership to be a model for the rest of the nation. This has been a very difficult time, I know, for all of us. And I just want to express, in particular, deep, deep respect for those remarkable leaders that are out there on the streets demanding that this be a moral moment and that we meet this moment. And that we do so, not because it's just the right thing to do, but it does justice to the promise, what we promote. Because one thing is clear to me, we have a hierarchy of values in this country that diminishes certain people based on their color of the skin. And we have perpetuated that hierarchy for centuries in this state. And we need to own up to that. And we need to foundationally rip that out of its root. When we talk about institutional racism, that's what we're talking about. And we become almost numb to it, blind to it. No one wants to go back to normalcy. If you want to go back to normalcy, I'm not going there with you. I don't want to go back to normalcy. I want something better. We deserve something more. Generation of young people demand something better and something more. Please resist normalcy. Normalcy created the conditions that led to this moment. Normalcy has no place in terms of our reconciliation of this moment. We have to meet a higher calling. We are so much better than this, so much more capable than this. We will rise up to this moment. We will lead, and we will listen, and we will begin to reconcile, but with resolve and a commitment and a persistence, not patience, that is demanding of this moment. And we will lead, guided by people like Ron and Latifah and many, many others that have been on the front lines. And with that, I want to now just turn over this mic to Latifah to talk a little bit more about what she hopes to accomplish, what she's been doing, and how she hopes to work with Ron Davis and others will advise us with the urgency that's needed at this moment to move in a direction that does justice to those cries that we are loudly hearing in the state of California. Latifah?
Thank you, Governor. My name is Latifah Simon. I'm the president of the Akhenaten Foundation, which is one of the state's first philanthropic institutions directly aimed at ending racialized injustice in the state of California. I also have the great pleasure of serving as the president of the board of directors for Bay Area Rapid Transit. But I come today not only with those roles, but after 25 years of working literally on the streets and in jails and in prisons for folks, many who have been denied justice. I'm hoping that I bring the spirit of the activists and organizers that I am currently learning from and have been learning from, and the mothers that I'm learning from who are calling for an end of unjust violence by the state. This inflection moment in this country and frankly around the world suggests that we get it right, that we identify this moment for what it is, a sea change in facing race and racism and deep injustice, and the work that we will do together will not simply be folks around the table. This call that the governor is asking us all now to accept is to rapidly bend the arc towards justice. It is our duty, and we must move forward expeditiously. No more. We can't go back. So for those men and women for decades and literally centuries who have been calling and demanding a shift, we owe them. We owe them. The shift in this state, the state will come first, and so goes the nation. 392, Governor mentioned it. He signed one of the country's most sweeping acts of legislation to direct a change in culture. And now we must move. Dr. Shelley Weber worked with women in communities all throughout the state who had to bury their sons, unarmed sons, to create and craft those words that are now law in the state of California. We've all watched the tape of the murder of Mr. Floyd. And we do this work in his daughter's name. We do the work that we will move forward in the names of men and women who want to do the right thing and uphold the sanctity of life for all of Californians. I'm ready to work. I'm ready to work. Hold us to task. We can change and swiftly enact a culture that refutes that false promise, or that false choice that we can't have it both ways. We can end racial injustice. Although change is not swift, it is rough, it is dirty oftentimes, and it's difficult, but we'll get there. I'm very excited to work with Ron Davis, who is a national champion for police reform and advising the governor. And we will work with other stakeholders swiftly with this office and with law enforcement to not only shift the conversation, but shift the practice. We do this work in the honor of justice. I'm very excited to begin this process. Let's go.
Good afternoon. Let me start by first thanking the governor for his leadership. What I really appreciated with his opening remarks was the candor and the truth that he told us about who we are, who we have been, and where we need to go. I think the governor recognizes that too often the truth does hurt. Too often the truth is uncomfortable. But even though the truth hurts, selective ignorance is fatal. We ignore the truth, we make mistakes. We ignore the truth, we threaten our very existence. We threaten this democracy, the state, the nation. And so we have to start with the truth and understand that the systems that the governor is talking about are not broken. There are many cases operating as designed, and we need to have new ones. That's why I really appreciated the idea of not going back to normalcy, but moving forward. I'm honored to be able to provide advice, and I think I bring a varied perspective, and it's personal for me. One, as you can see, I'm standing here as an African-American male and know what it's like to be a black man in America. And when I was a cop and I was not in uniform, what it's like to see a police car behind you. Know what it's like when I have 3 kids to have to tell all 3 of my kids what to do when stopped by the police, have to prepare them to be safe against the people that I respect and work with and wore the same uniform I did. That conflict has been something I struggled with for 30 years on how to reconcile it. And I've found a way to reconcile it, which I think the governor's leading the state to do. You don't reconcile it by trying to fit them into a safe narrative. You don't reconcile it by ignoring the truth or history. You accept each for the truth that they represent and you move forward. And I think that's what we need to do here. I also spent 30 years as a cop, as the governor mentioned. So that perspective has meaning to me. I'm proud to work as a cop, and I can't think of no more noble profession or the group of men and women that I work with are so honorable, courageous. And I spent 20 years in the beautiful and diverse city of Oakland. And then I spent close to 9 years as the police chief in the equally beautiful and diverse city of East Palo Alto. And those close to 30 years taught me that police, when operating appropriately, can make a difference. And then I also spent 3.5 years in the Obama administration, as the governor mentioned, to be able to work with the thousands of police departments. There's over 16,000 police departments in the United States, local, state, county, and tribal. And as a director of the COPS office, I had to work with a lot of them. It included going to Ferguson, going to Baltimore, working with San Francisco Police Department with their collaborative reform. We even did an after-action review of Ferguson to understand what went right and what went wrong, the 50 caliber weapons, the militarization of the police. So we know there's roadmaps out there. When Michael Brown was killed following that tragedy, President Obama created the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And I had the honor of serving as the executive director and traveled around the country with the task force with listening sessions, listening to experts and victims and families and academics and union and police officers and sheriffs, everyone trying to identify what are the best methods moving forward. I appreciate the governor's stance. We don't have time to relitigate the causes. We know the causes. The governor outlined some of them today. What we need to do is focus on the remedies and to move forward so that we turn all these plans that do exist into actions. So for me, I was there during Rodney King as a cop. I was there during Freddie Gray in the Obama administration. Each one was a certain moment. I do believe that this is a movement. And I'll close with a call to my fellow law enforcement leaders. In the 60s, we have evidence and videos, and we celebrate some of the courageous actions of civil rights people that stood against the oppression that we provided them as police officers, whether it was the Edmund Pettus Bridge, whether it was demonstrations. And our job was to oppress and to stop the expression of First Amendment rights. In 2020, we have now come to the point where our job should be to protect the civil rights and to the First Amendment rights so that people can protest in peace. There's only 2 types of protests we should not accept, and that's silence and violence. And silence does no one any good, and violence is just unacceptable. So what I tell my law enforcement leaders, I will call to action as we move forward with this, that we will be getting a hold of you, that we will be collaborating with you. We need time for you to stand up. I've saw a lot of chiefs take a knee, and that is great, but now take a stance, and take a stance for systemic reform and changes. I saw a lot of people say they want to make changes. Well, this is the opportunity. Let's make this movement not against the police. Let's do it with the police so that we can make changes about our systems that everyone benefits. I look forward to, you heard the passionate speakings of Lateef, and I look forward to working with my colleagues and under the leadership of the governor. I think we can actually get some things done that will not only make policing practices better in California, it will help start changing the culture of policing as a profession. And I agree with everyone that says when California does something, the nation does follow. So it is an honor to actually be able to help the governor's effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Lateef. And let me just build on Ron's comments because I think they're important to underscore at the same time. As a former police officer himself, as someone who recognized and deserves to be recognized, police officers, not just chiefs, of all stripes all across this country. You see images of police officers dancing with protesters, bending down on one knee with protesters. Members of our own National Guard, not just cleaning up graffiti here in Northern California, but in Southern California, a whole crew bending down on one knee in solidarity with the protesters. There is so much nobility to those men and women as well that need to be recognized at this moment. I know firsthand the courageousness of many in law enforcement, overwhelming number of our men and women in uniform that go to work every single day to do justice to this collective cause of making more gentle the life of our world. And they're as horrified by what is happening as anybody. That includes California Highway Patrol. It includes all the men and women of law enforcement across the spectrum, deputy sheriffs, as well as members of local law enforcement. So I want to distinguish the principles that we're trying to advance as a collective cause. And the spirit of what I think brings Ron to the forefront of leadership is that recognition. There's that old African proverb, we cannot quote it enough, that if you want to go fast, you can go alone, but if you want to go far in the cause of justice, you've got to go together. And when we signed 392 and 230 last year, we did that in the spirit of collaboration and cooperation. We didn't agree on every issue, but we didn't come at it with closed fists, with open hearts and hands, and we worked together with law enforcement to advance the most significant use of force, deadly use of force provisions of any state in this nation. And I believe that is the spirit that brings Ron to his leadership position, brings Latifah here today, and certainly that's the spirit we'll carry forward. And it's also the spirit of collaboration, not just with those in positions of formal authority, but others that are exercising not just formal authority, but moral authority, like the leaders of the Black Caucus in the California legislature, the Latino caucus, and others that we look forward to working with on a legislative package of reforms. And I want to thank all the leaders of the Black Caucus in the state of California for their incredible stewardship, their capacity of leadership that's demonstrable by the work that they've been doing for years and years over the course of not only their careers, but over the course particularly of the last 12 months, where historic number of bills were advanced because of their example and their support. And we need that collaboration. We need their example, their voice at this moment as well. Final point, because it's important, Ron made about the issue of silence. I want to encourage those of us that are prone to silence at this moment to consider not just Ron's words, but to consider Dante's words. Dante infamously said that the hottest place in hell is reserved for those in a time of moral crisis that maintain their neutrality. This is not a time to be neutral. It's not about picking sides. It's about recognizing that the conditions that led to this moment cannot persist. We cannot be neutral about that. We need to stand up and at least recognize that. It's not a political statement, but I believe evidence that is abundant. It's a statement of fact. So let us resolve, each and every one of us, to lead at this moment. Sure, those in positions of authority, but all of us have the capacity to lead. And I think, as one young lady told me in Stockton just yesterday, that leaders encourage others to lead. That's the most important job we all have, is to create conditions where people can thrive and people can live their lives out loud. And so with that, I look forward to answering any questions, but moreover, I look forward to the days, months, years ahead of hard work and the tenacity to build trust once again, communities all across this state and nation.
Hi, Governor. Nicole Nixon with CAP Radio News, and I will be asking questions on behalf of the press today. I'd like to hear a little more about the specific policies you would support to address some of these racial inequity issues. You mentioned the Black Legislative Caucus. They put out a list of priority bills that includes a constitutional amendment for affirmative action, parole and probation reforms, and a reparations task force. What do you plan to throw your weight behind?
Well, we've supported all three of those efforts, so already have publicly done so and continue to. But beyond that, we have our own reforms that are presented as incredible opportunity at this moment. As many know, we made commitments last year, signed bills to shut down private prisons. We've made commitments that are presented in front of the California legislature that I believe they're opposed to support by eliminating the Department of Juvenile Justice to advance probation reform. We don't need a new bill in our budget we seed those reforms, seed the reforms to continue our efforts to focus on rehabilitation, higher education opportunities for youth offenders in this budget. Those opportunities present themselves in real time. Working with the legislature over the next few weeks, we'll have the opportunity to anchor those reforms in the trailer bills that are part of this budget package. So many things have been proposed in terms of affirmative action, which I've long supported, righting that wrong as it relates to those changed. As it relates to the issues of reparations, working to study and understand more broadly what that looks like, what that means. We've been public in our support in that space, and continuing the cause that unites all of us, not only in this moment, but the deeper structural cause of addressing the underlying issues as it relates to disparities from the health perspective, environmental justice perspective, and focusing on economic justice as well.
What are the state's plans to address an anticipated surge in coronavirus cases due to the protests? And should counties start preparing to pull back some of their reopenings?
We have a plan that is detailed, plans that are required of each county in the state of California. They're called attestation plans, they're containment plans, they are prevention plans. Those plans are available for review for everybody on covid19.ca.gov. You can click on to any county in the state of California, see what your county health director in partnership in council with local elected officials have put up as it relates to resources in these areas, as it relates to testing capacity, tracing and tracking capacity, isolation protocols and programs, efforts to protect the most vulnerable California, those in skilled nursing facilities, homeless individuals, people that are incarcerated, strategies for alternative care sites, and capacity on PPE and human resources. I say all that to make this point. Those plans are up on that website, and we have, over the course of the last 100 days, been preparing our efforts here in the state of California for an anticipated increase in cases as we begin to reopen our economy, not just in the context of these protests, that we will see an increase in cases, and our capacity has never been greater to meet the needs from an ICU perspective, a hospitalization perspective, an alternative care perspective, and a PPE perspective. That BYD contract, as just one proof point, over 90 million masks have come in off that contract. And as a consequence, we've been able to distribute tens of millions of masks throughout our economy, different sectors of our economy, including commitments we're making to our public education system, our child care providers, and essential workers that are disproportionately represented in the Black and brown communities. So all of that is part and parcel of our strategies and our efforts to prepare for reopening broadly defined and clearly prepare for an increase of cases related to the mixing that has occurred because of these protests.
Some questions about that BYD mask deal related to N95 masks. What is the status of that? There was another deadline today. Have you negotiated an extension on that? And if that deal does fall through, how are you going to secure more N95 masks?
We're working across overseas to get the latest information. Apparently it's coming in today. I'll have more clarification. Hopefully that has already come back. The contract, we pay for what we get. We don't pay for things we don't get. We've already received over 90 million masks. That has provided an unprecedented level of capacity for this state, unprecedented in any other state in this country, that has allowed us to distribute tens of millions of masks that otherwise would not have been afforded. So I'm very pleased with that progress, and to the extent that the N95 component of those masks, not just the procedure masks and surgical masks, are not part of that. We've been working with other providers, and we'll have a backup to that backup, but we'll get some clarification, we hope, as early as today.
Question comes from Jeremy White of Politico. Today, the White House economic advisor Stephen Moore said that the new jobs report shows we don't need more coronavirus aid and there's no reason to have a major spending bill. What is your response to that?
I think that's foolhardy. I think that's short-sighted, and I think the reality on the ground suggests something very, very differently. Just because you had some good news, and I'm very pleased with that good news as it relates to the national unemployment, that's the numbers in the aggregate. We don't live in the aggregate. We have 50 different states, 50 different conditions, and the economic pressures are profound all across this nation. The budget shortfalls are legendary in terms of their status, the number of cities and counties and states that are struggling to make just foundational commitments, let alone make the commitments that this moment requires as it relates to investments in the future. And so I appreciate that's their sentiment today. We hope that sentiment is not broadly shared. Certainly it is not shared by our leader, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and her colleagues in the U.S. House of Representatives that have approached this very differently with, I think, much more depth of understanding than is reflected by that comment from that one individual advisor.
I got a couple questions about nail salons. Some reporters have been told that the state no longer believes the first case of community transmission occurred in a nail salon, as you mentioned last month. Do you still stand by that? And what are your plans for reopening nail salons?
Well, we're looking forward to putting out additional guidelines today that should put further clarification on the next iteration of opportunities for counties to continue a phased reopening. I'll remind everybody when we put out guidelines in every sector, including the work we're doing with the Asian Caucus in the state of California, working with nail salon industry to put out the guidelines in this space we've been working on over the last few weeks. We put out a document that is a how document, but it does not prescribe when these counties move forward. That will be on the basis of counties making that determination for themselves based upon the unique conditions in their respective communities. So those guidelines are forthcoming. And as you know, and many others that have been watching some of these daily briefings, we put out guidelines with fairly consistent cadence on a weekly basis in each sector, and many more are being released this afternoon.
This is the last question. It comes from Kathleen Renane of the AP. You have stated repeatedly that decisions on curfews and the National Guard should be made locally. But given that demonstrations in recent days have been largely peaceful, do you think it's a good idea for cities like Sacramento to continue to impose curfews and keep the National Guard in town, especially given that some troops have been pulled away from coronavirus aid projects to monitor protests?
Yeah, as it relates to this issue, as a former mayor, I deeply respect the work that mayors are doing at the local level, and to the extent that they recognize the conditions have changed for the positive, I would highly encourage them to pull back on those supports. And so my hope and expectation is that many local elected officials and law enforcement officials will no longer be in need of those state assists, and that we can begin to pull back in an expeditious manner, but in a very thoughtful manner as it relates to the conditions changing at the local level. So I appreciate their work, the hard work that many mayors have in front of them, but again, those that are seeing a radical change, and by the way, a number of mayors have already pulled back, and we are pulling back those supports, so it's already occurring. I hope we're going to hear more and more from those local electeds and others in the next days so that we can more appropriately redeploy those guardsmen and women to do more logistics support, as you suggest, in our food banks and to continue efforts on COVID-19 relief and support. Let me just thank the support of Ron and Latifah, supports that we've been provided by leaders all across the state of California for guiding us, counseling us, giving us the courage to resolve to do more and do better in the state. Let me thank again to all of the work that's being done in the California legislature and by mayors and municipal leaders to begin the process anew of more transparency, more accountability, and the structural reforms that are needed at this moment. We will not sit back patiently. We will not sit back passively as a state. We will lead. We will lead in. We will take account. We will take responsibility, and we will take to heart the message that clearly is being expansed very loudly in this state and all across this nation by protesters, and that is a resolve to do better and do more, and in turn, meet this moment head on. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, and stay safe this weekend, and we look forward to coming back and updating you very, very near future. Thank you.